Good afternoon for everybody where it's afternoon, and good morning for others on the East Coast. Thank you for joining us today for today's webinar. Our presenter is Heather Kahle, and she is originally from Sudbury, but she's currently working as an ergonomist in WorkSafeBC's Risk Analysis Unit. Her presentation today is going to be a risk-based approach to fatigue in the workplace. Her presentation is going to be 30-35 minutes long, and then there will be an opportunity at the end for questions. If you have questions during the presentation, just put them in the chat box, and then I'll collect them as we go, and we can save them all for the end. All right, so Heather, let's get started.
Terrific. Well, thank you. I just want to thank CROSH, Courtney, and Toby, who I've been working alongside to get all the technology working. Toby's our stagehand in behind, making sure everything's seamless. So thank you for that. And to Courtney for that wonderful introduction. It's such a pleasure to work with CROSH in Sudbury, partly having grown up there, but additionally because they've been so active in the fatigue arena for already several years. And so I see this webinar today is just building on and contributing, hopefully, to some of the excellent work that's already been done and is currently underway at CROSH. CROSH being the Center for Research in Occupational Safety and Health, associated with Laurentian University in Sudbury. And so hoping to build on this topic and some of the things that have already been done through CROSH, including some archived webinars. I know a few years back they had quite a large fatigue conference, and our team at WorkSafeBC attended a webinar relating to a fatigue toolkit. And then most recently, Dr. Sandra Dorman presented a webinar on the implications of daylight saving time. And now I'm working with Courtney on the development of a multi-chapter fatigue booklet. And it's really going to be an excellent resource with academic references, but also quick reference sheets. So just hoping to build on that work that's been done. And so I'd like to just welcome everybody online today. I see I've been reached out to by a few, and so thank you, and so glad that you could join us today. We have participants from around the province and around Canada coming to us from different agencies, including, of course, mining, the academic sector, pharmacy, fishing, cranes, training, and other health and safety agencies. So quite a great broad mixture that hoping to engage today. And on the note of engagement, just like to welcome and invite your participation. Predominantly throughout, it'll be via the chat box, as we'd like to hold our questions to the end. But if you do have a thought or a comment relating to a certain slide, happy to pop that in the chat box and make a note, and then Courtney will be monitoring that. And then we can follow up on it and circle back to it. And then I'd also like to encourage you, if you would like to chat with others, it's a dynamic way to engage with others who may be on the line. So just a little bit about me. I am a human factor specialist. I've been at WorkSafeBC for the last 25 years. But just more recently, I won't get into all my endeavors. I've been working in the fatigue-related area since about 2016 when I joined the Risk Analysis Unit. And at that point, I started to take quite a bit of a deeper dive into the science and meeting many world leaders. What ended up being a kickoff meeting for me. It was a fatigue forum in Montreal in actually 2018. And so I'd been doing a lot of reading up to that point, and then actually got a chance to meet Dr. Imelda Wong and Dr. Drew Dawson and many other world leaders in the areas of fatigue science and how to manage fatigue successfully across multiple modes of transportation. Including the impact of shift work on your health and technology. And then it was from there that we learned so much, and we began ourselves, WorkSafeBC, delving into hosting several different events with a provincial with a provincial risk management forum on fatigue. And then shortly thereafter, we embarked on a systematic review with Dr. Drew Dawson and his team of experts. And currently, we're actually developing a information sheet and a web page that will serve as a launch point for all fatigue-related resources. So, so the discussion is continuing. It's very active and alive and vibrant in BC, and as I'm sure across Canada, especially with the CSA developing a national standard for Canadian first responders on the topic of fatigue risk management. So that's just a bit of background, and I've left my contact information to the end of the webinar in the resource section if you'd like to reach out to me personally with any questions or comments. And so just to getting started, I'm going to be today presenting, as was introduced, a risk-based approach to fatigue in the workplace. And I'll be in particular highlighting two different models. One model you're probably perhaps already using or aware of and maybe familiar with. And then there's an alternative approach that I'll be introducing today. It's not new, but it may be new for many of us online today. And then I guess my only other caveat is being with the Occupational Health and Safety Regulator here in BC, I will be offering perspectives today that do relate to our mandate and the goal of our agency as an Occupational Health and Safety Regulator. Okay, so I'm going to get started now. Oops, how am I gonna advance the slide? Oh, there we are. Okay. So just providing a roadmap, literally with the background being a road, a roadmap for today's webinar. I'm going to begin in the upper left-hand corner with explaining fatigue, and then moving on from there to workplace risk factors that influence fatigue. And then I'll be jumping up to some approaches, describing an alternative approach. And then what can we do in terms of tackling fatigue risk management, and where could we begin if you wanted to start on this journey? And from there, I'll be presenting some of the excerpts that are coming out of the bulletin, soon to be published by WorkSafeBC. Okay, so beginning with fatigue. Fatigue has been a topic that's received much attention over many, many decades, and has been very heavily researched by many throughout the world. I wanted to draw us back to the Transportation Safety Board. It continues to list fatigue as a key issue across multiple transportation modes, citing fatigue contributing or in some cases even causal across 90 incidents since 1982. So it continues to be on their watch list. And so with that, it's not hard. In fact, it would probably be easy to imagine how fatigue could play a role in adverse events. From rail disasters, both locally and abroad, there was a recent snowbird crash, but there's been other snowbird crashes that have splashed across the headlines relating to fatigue. Out here in BC, we've seen the BC Place Stadium roof incident, multiple paramedic incidents, as well as rail crashes in Prince George. So there's been many incidents relating to fatigue. So we understand how it can play a contributory role, but managing the risk in practice, in some cases, is not as easy. So what I want to do today is highlight the risk in this section and some of the effects, and then delve into tasks that are particularly vulnerable to fatigue. So we know fatigue affects everyone. None of us are excluded, regardless of our skill, knowledge, or training, or industry. It influences directly on our ability, our physical abilities and our mental abilities. And even it can influence our ability to carry out even simple tasks. So what I've provided for you on the screen there is a definition that we have agreed on at WorkSafeBC. And one of the big things that we've highlighted in ours is it's a change in a physiological state. It's often described with words as being tired or drowsy, but it's actually our body's response to sleep deprivation or lengthy physical or mental work. This definition has some very common thread that are used in many definitions throughout the world, including a change in state that leads to reduced capacity or physical performance. And it can also, many definitions also include like what fatigue results from, meaning like what causes it. And many definitions include like the lack of restorative sleep or disruptions in our circadian rhythm or our natural body clock. Disruptions to those things can also lead to fatigue. Definitions vary from industry to industry. I've seen some very medical-based definitions. I've also seen some physiology-based ones. There's social-based ones. And there's a long list of definitions that can be found in a document that the CSA produced. Back in 2019, they sponsored an environmental scan and literature review, and it's called Workplace Fatigue, Current Landscape and Future Considerations, and I've tagged it at the end of my presentation. It's a publicly released document, and it defines fatigue, looks at legislation from across the world, explores best practices, and talks about the areas particularly of assessment, education, and holistic approaches which include a fatigue risk management system. And more on that coming a little bit later. But you'll see early on in the document, there's a couple of tables. And if you look at the tables 2 and 3, it describes fatigue from multiple perspectives. So just a couple of other points that I wanted to raise during the describing fatigue is that it's a contributory factor. So WorkSafeBC defines it as such, and we don't refer to it or treat it as a hazard. And this is different than many out there. There's a body of research produced, the ACOEM statement. It's the Presidential Task Force on Fatigue Risk Management, and there's many others that actually refer to fatigue as the hazard, and we do not. And this is in alignment with the Transportation Safety Board as well, talking about it as being a contributory factor. And so with it not being the hazard, we would of course look to the workplace as having the hazards, and how fatigue can actually escalate the risk of harm when they're exposed to hazards. So an example that I provide there is operating mobile equipment or driving, which we're all quite familiar with. So if you're driving and you're on a rural road in the middle of the night and it's windy, those are the things that pose the hazard. Being fatigued just would escalate the potential for harm. So some of the effects of fatigue, we've all experienced probably some of these, having perhaps gotten less than our optimal 7 to 9 hours of sleep. But I just wanted to point out that it's a change in our physiological state. We feel tired, but there are actual physiological changes that we experience and we see. And so some of these things include slower reaction times. So when it comes to noticing and responding to changes in the environment, when something unexpected happens, like perhaps when you're driving, reduced levels of alertness and vigilance. That can include and also involves impacts on decision-making, like reduced decision-making, complex planning, and that can involve sequencing of information, organizing, and processing information as well. And also it affects our memory and our recall of facts, and it is widely known to affect communication and reduce the ability to communicate details, perhaps as the details that might be needed in a shift handover, or when you're explaining a task. These are all things that can be impaired with fatigue, and of course, a reduced ability to concentrate. So all of these factors increase risk when doing tasks at work. And this is illustrated in this chart. So along the y-axis, you have the relative risk, and on the x-axis, we're showing the hours of sleep. So researchers Lombardi and Simon Foucault at the University of Paris Descartes have published work relating, and they can expand on this topic much more than what I'm showing today, indicating the risk of how the timing of shifts, the length of shifts, and the consecutive number of shifts all have an impact on risk of injury or relative risk. Errors associated with fewer hours of sleep increase and this increase increases the likelihood of an unsuccessful interaction with a hazard. And so up to this point, we know that we're not going to be able to eradicate fatigue. Dr. Drew Dawson and all the experts would say it's here to stay, not just because of the invention of the light bulb back in the 1800s and not because of the increasing socioeconomic drive to work 24/7, but partly because of the human biological dynamic as well. So we can't eradicate fatigue. And so we have a compelling argument to consider the task hazard itself, which can in some cases be eliminated or for sure reduced. And then how can we influence the workplace factors that influence fatigue? Okay, so I want to begin by looking at some of the tasks that are uniquely vulnerable to fatigue. So we know the impact of fatigue can decrease our ability to notice, attend to details, check or question if there's uncertainty. And this can impact, you would probably think, nearly every single human activity, which is true. There is a risk that performance across all these activities can be affected and definitely reduced. But some tasks like monitoring and detection are particularly vulnerable to fatigue. So when you have monitoring processes where you're trying to look at maybe perhaps a bank of computer screens, these are particularly sensitive to fatigue. As well, performing calculations, particularly mental calculations, and performing tasks that involve your memory, perhaps a number of steps, or recalling, say for example, tag numbers. These are all particularly vulnerable. And as well, using or communicating details relating to procedures, often maybe a change in conditions or details that might be needed in a shift handover. These are all particularly vulnerable to lapses in attention and and slower reaction times. So if safety critical tasks involve these characteristics, then this can help us prioritize the tasks that may need further assessment. So an example of what you might be faced with is, again, going back to a driving example, driving mobile equipment and driving in general is particularly sensitive to fatigue, partly because it's a routine overlearned behavior. And we're often in a sedentary position while we're driving, and we're sometimes in dim light, particularly if it's at night. So that makes it particularly vulnerable, but there might be aspects of driving, perhaps a mobile equipment with carrying a load of lumber or some other load that would be less sensitive to fatigue. And that could include like the journey planning piece, checking the load, securing the load, securing the vehicle, refueling. These are things that may be less sensitive. So you can look at tasks that would be more sensitive versus those that may be overall less sensitive. Okay, so some of these are incidents you're probably all too familiar with. And it's a nice follow-on from our last slide, because we know that certain tasks are particularly vulnerable. We talked about monitoring, we talked about calculations, and we talked about procedures. And so with these incidents, some of the most significant accidents in the history of the world, including the 3 Mile Island, the grounding of the Exxon Valdez tanker, these all involved tasks that were particularly sensitive to fatigue and happened to occur at night during the early morning hours when, on the one hand, vigilance is quite low and our drive to sleep is the highest. So in 1986, in our upper left corner of the screen, you had the Chernobyl, which involved control room operations, which is associated with a high degree of vigilance, monitoring decisions, and errors were made while working long hours in the night to meet some deadlines. 3 Mile Island is quite similar, as are the rest of them, including reduced recognition of changes that were taking place in the environment, and then also a reduced ability to take corrective actions. And then with the Exxon Valdez, it occurred at 12:15 a.m. And due to workload and reduced staffing levels, and again, errors that were made in the path of that. And then the Challenger, that's probably more widely known about the poor decisions that were made during the night before the launch, and multiple factors going on there, but trying to make decisions and doing complex planning amidst the overall system pressures. And then in 2005, there was the BP Texas explosion. And the U.S. Chemical Safety Board found, not unsurprising, critical errors were made. And they discovered that the board operator had been working long hours for 29 consecutive days. So those are some of the historical outcomes that we might be aware of, but I wanted to draw us a little bit closer to home. And because I'm talking about BC and Ontario, and maybe perhaps people in the middle, I've tried to draw from East and West Coast examples. So the top left example, it was an example of some paramedics that lost their life. Paramedics had been off duty for only just 5 hours when they're actually called back to work in the wee hours of the morning to transfer. To conduct a patient transfer. And you can see there were, this was the road that they were driving on, and what happened is the ambulance ended up jumping up onto the concrete barrier with both right sides, with both right tires over the edge of the barrier. And near the end of the barrier, the ambulance unfortunately overbalanced towards the lake and tumbled down the embankment. And then on the lower left-hand corner of the screen, that was prior to the Olympics. And we actually had a massive project taking place on the Sea to Sky Highway that you can just see there in our beautiful skyline and our some of our mountains. I will say today it's sunny, one of our first sunny days in a long time. And for that incident, we actually had a co-op student working on the Sea to Sky project and promised initially accommodation after working a long hour, but then literally at the 11th hour was told that accommodations wouldn't be available, and so began to embark on a 2.5-hour commute home, and unfortunately failed to navigate some of those turns, and unfortunately passed away. And then in the lower right hand, we have an incident from the Chicago O'Hare rail system. It's a transit authority, and a train collided with a bumping post near the end of the track. And the operator, again, had been working extensive hours for multiple, like 12 days in a row. And then I can point to many rail incidents. There, Alberta, the Hinton Rail disaster of 1986. There's been a CP crash in PG and around the province. And then even, I mean, hindsight is 2020, but prior to the Lac-Mégantic, there was recognition of fatigue and some of the implications for the rail industry. So, what influences fatigue? We're going to get into some of the description around the task, the environment, and the hours. And there are different models out there. Different universities in the United States and even across Canada take a look at the factors that influence fatigue. Some of them might be physiological or described as mental or medical. But for the purposes of today, I will be limiting this discussion to the task, environment, and I've abbreviated scheduling to hours to fit onto the slide. So we know insufficient restorative sleep is probably the most important factor that contributes to fatigue. So that includes like the quality and as well the quantity of sleep. And so even though there are many other personal factors that contribute to fatigue, including medical, travel plans, personal, etc., we'll be limiting it to task, environment, and scheduling. And so under the task, these are things like workload, being machine paced, and including maybe boring or mundane tasks, or tasks and activities where you have sustained mental and or physical exertion. And it could also involve complex situations as well, where there might be complex training, communication, detailed procedures, etc. There's also a whole host of environmental factors that are widely documented in the research that also influence fatigue, including temperatures, both on the cold side and on the warm side. Noise levels, again, too loud or too quiet. Light levels, same thing. Vibration, same thing. Humidity, and low levels of stimulation. So the environment actually plays quite a key role in influencing fatigue. And so this is, you know, combined, all these factors basically create a framework to consider when looking at fatigue. And so then finally, we have the scheduling bucket, or the hours of service or hours of work bucket. And that can include a lot of different things, including irregular hours, night shifts, shift rotation patterns, back-to-backs, etc. And I think it can be summed up with, you know, in our, not just related to COVID, but like in our current economic climate, like there's this increasing drive to work more and to work longer. And so, you know, we're having increasing ways of trying to manage the risk by designing shift patterns and different working hour arrangements that comprise a lot of different arrangements. Okay, so from the factors that influence fatigue, I've explained what it is and some of the risks associated with being fatigued, and what contributes to fatigue, what influences. And so wanted to kind of look into now what can be done. And so in the last several decades, there's been an over-reliance on personal prescriptive measures. There's been numerous accidents, and you know, the TSB mentioned has cited transportation incidents and has exclaimed that they need more time to develop more effective approaches. So in the wake of that, through the 1990s and into the early 2000s, there was a large reliance on hours of work, assuming that better work schedules would actually constitute a safe work system. But we know that that's just not the case, and it's actually kind of an archaic, outdated approach. And in 2000, the Australian government and even earlier than that, our own Canadian government undertook some inquiries. The Australian one was the Midnight Oil Inquiry, and they, at that point, after a long research project, determined that a risk-based approach is definitely the best way to go. So as a result of that inquiry, the Midnight Oil Inquiry, two models emerged. The first model involves looking more closely at people or teams, so individuals or teams. And so on the one side, there's nuances between the team and the individual, so I've separated it out. In some cases, the factors, how you respond to fatigue and controls are different between individuals and teams. And then on the other side, we have task, where the starting point quite literally is the task. So just to explain the one model, the person-centered model, which was on the left side of your screen, the starting point is the actual opportunity for sleep. And basically the arrows going down follow kind of an error trajectory. And if you work backwards from a fatigue related incident, there's an assumption that prior to a fatigue-related incident, you have fatigue-related errors, and preceding that, you have fatigue-related symptoms, which might be behavioral symptoms, including anything from eye closing to errors, slowed reaction time, etc. And then prior to having symptoms, then they believe that you didn't obtain the sleep that you needed to obtain, and it might be tied in with not having the opportunity to sleep. So that's the kind of the hazard assessment. And the one kind of overarching principle with this approach is that it is taking the approach that fatigue is the hazard. And so with many things, when something is the hazard, especially in occupational health and safety, when you're dealing with a hazard, then you seek to measure what's going on with the hazard and try to assess the hazard and try to control the hazard. So in this model, they're really trying to control the fatigue, and it promotes well-being and health conversations, which is good. It's definitely it's a widely used approach, and I know the National Safety Council in the United States and others are trying to promote getting good sleep, like a fitness conversation. Like they're trying to have a parallel. Like right now, if you say, oh, I had a good workout and I'm eating a salad, and they're applauding your efforts for being so healthy, and they're trying to get similar conversations going on for sleep to say, oh, I had a good night's sleep last night, and applauding people for getting good night's sleep. And so while this is all good, these recommendations aren't compatible with the perspective of the Occupational Health and Safety Regulator in British Columbia. It's outside of our mandate to control lifestyle issues, and we don't have control over people's sleeping hygiene, the temperature in their room, whether or not they have blinds, whether or not they've muzzled the dog, they ingesting caffeine or carbohydrates. But what we do have control over are the hazards at work. And so our prevention officers won't be asking about sleep hygiene routines, but they can inquire and collect information on what you've been doing to mitigate the hazards, and looking at tasks that are particularly vulnerable to fatigue. And just along this line, I mean, there's some other nuances in behind it that even prominent fatigue experts in the United States and from around the world have determined that some of the personal strategies that might be involved, involving like napping, caffeine, etc., have not as high certainty and evidence of being effective in the workplace as what we would like. So moving on to the task-centered approach, how this works is you identify the safety critical activity at the top, and then you work through the hierarchy going down through the successive levels. And so we've talked about some safety critical tasks at the outset, and then you would determine how does fatigue potentially increase the risk of harm. And so that might look like, are there errors? Is there potential for an injury? Is there potential for death, to kill themselves or others? And once you know the risk of harm, then you determine the likelihood, which can be based on, which would be based on your worst case scenario, but just using a fairly straightforward risk matrix. And then moving on to controlling the hazard from our earlier graph that talked about the task. So controlling the task hazards at the source and applying the risk control hierarchy. Okay, so moving into, what are some things that we can do? And I want to point out that there are many, many things out there that can be done, from education to changing our procurement practices, evaluating barriers. There's the health and wellness spectrum conversations that are important to have, reporting, investigation. So there are a wealth of things that are being done and need to be done, but I'm going to be limiting my conversation today to the risk management process. And so what might that look like for fatigue? So we want you to consider some of like the risk management process in relation to some of your workplace activities. And so where it could start is looking at identifying tasks. And a good starting point would be the list I provided you earlier on some tasks that are particularly vulnerable to fatigue. And that list of tasks is much more expanded in one of the references that I've supplied for you in the resource section from the oil and gas industry. So you could look at tasks that are particularly vulnerable, set the priority there. Do they involve particularly demanding work regimes, or does it involve safety critical tasks such as driving, working at height, or operating equipment? And then moving on to assessing what? Assessing the consequences. So asking ourselves, like, how does fatigue increase the risk of harm? So if you're fatigued, could you skip a step? And what is the potential of skipping the step, and what are potentially the consequences? I mean, if you convey the wrong information, or mistranslate something, or misapply information, or don't react quickly enough, I mean, are we looking at errors? Are we looking at an injury, or is there opportunity for even death? So then on the control side of things, this is the familiar risk control hierarchy, starting with eliminating the hazard. And eliminating is often an interesting question, because you say, well, we need to drive, or we need to work, we need to do X. But very often in considering when and how the work is done, there is sometimes opportunity to actually eliminate the hazard altogether. And then moving down to levels that are less effective, you can have substituting the hazard, isolating from the hazard, and administrative and PPE controls. And so as we head into kind of wrapping up, I wanted to leave you with some key questions. And so we know that hazards exist at every workplace. And we also know, probably both personally and in the research, we are all tired. We're all tired to some degree at all points. And so, knowing these things, then we ask ourselves the questions, do hazards at your workplace increase the risk of harm when workers are fatigued? And are you currently using practices in your workplace that are relying on alertness measures such as caffeine intake as a safeguard? And is that sustainable? Is it effective? How are workers and processes being protected if fatigue is present? And does or can the design of your workplace accommodate fatigued workers? So based on a very familiar risk control hierarchy, the famous triangle that many of us are probably familiar with, starting at the top with the most effective strategies and going down to the apex, which is the least effective, we've kind of modified a risk control hierarchy for fatigue, seeing that, PPE doesn't quite fit in all cases for fatigue. So in terms of being the most effective, we're asking questions like, does the task need to be done at all? Can it be redesigned? When does it need to be done? Can that be changed? Moving on to the environment, can aspects of the environment, there's noise, vibration, lighting, temperature, humidity, can aspects of the environment be influenced to increase alertness, or alternatively reduce fatigue? And then scheduling hours of service. Can it be, I see, yeah, a question at the bottom there. Can it be done at a different time? So just an overview of some of the things that we have going on and have had going on. Historically, we got into some fatigue risk management forums following or engaging with some of the both BC experts and experts from around Canada. We've had local community of practice events, funded research. We're just wrapping up our systematic review, and we are going to be producing a information sheet and a web page. And we are currently working with several employers and health and safety associations, CCOHS, and others to engage in the conversation and see how we can effectively and collaboratively work together for consistency and effectivity. And then other initiatives that I know that have taken place and are ongoing are, we had a cross-jurisdictional survey that began in Newfoundland, and it went right across Canada to explore what's happening. The National Safety Council has had a fatigue ongoing for several years. Underway right now is an initiative with the CSA to develop a first responders fatigue risk management standard. CCOHS is updating their OSH answers to reflect current science. And as I mentioned earlier, CROSH is developing like a multi-chapter booklet. And so there are those resources that I mentioned. I will say that I could fill up 10 pages of references, but these are the cream of the crop. Assessing risk from operator fatigue is a paper that came out of the oil and gas industry in 2014, and it literally underpins the approach that we are going to be taking. Staying Alert was a paper that was presented at a conference in 2019 with Dr. Chasen Colho, and it again gives an excellent model for incorporating fatigue and risk management. And then Australia, they are world leaders when it comes to managing the risk of fatigue at in the workplace. And they have a number of different models that also include the work tasks and some of the work influences, and not just taking or not just only considering that single trajectory of personal factors. And then the UK is a close second to Australia with lots of resources around effectively managing the risk of fatigue. Okay, so I will open up the floor to questions, and the next slide has my contact information. And I just want to thank you for everybody for paying attention.
Hi, sorry, I just had to get unmuted there.
Sure.
All right, so there's a couple questions here for you. The first is actually an invite to see if you wanted to be on a radio show. So their contact information is actually in the Q&A, and I also told them that they could email you directly with your contact information.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I can put that up now.
All right, so perfect. And then we have another couple questions. So one is from Roberta, and she wants to know what your position on sleep measurement wearable devices are, and not specifically for an employer's perspective, but with respect to conducting research or getting a better understanding of an occupation.
Mm-hmm. Sleep devices that measure fatigue, Actigraph and the Fitbits are definitely a tool. There's also biomathematical modeling, and they are widely used, and we are working with employers that are currently engaging with them, so they definitely have a place and they can be valuable. But I can send you information from CASA. It's the Civil Aviation Safety Authority. We have papers on this from both Canada and as well in Australia, where they've made probably the biggest leaps and bounds. And I'm just repeating what they would say in the paper, that to move forward with caution. And we have experienced this both personally with working with some companies that have endeavored down that path, collecting the information. Often it results in a lot of information, and so still tying it in with like the first phase of looking at the task is still going to be a requirement. The oil and gas producers in their 2014 paper actually said phase one ideally is looking at the task. So start with the task. What are your most vulnerable tasks, and what is the potential outcome? So that would be your starting point, and that is more or less of a qualitative, it's quite a qualitative endeavor, where you would be asking, like in the words of Dr. Drew Dawson, what are the dumb things that happen when people are fatigued? And so you begin to collect a repertoire of information about like the switches, the controls, the startup processes, the procedures that are incompatible with people being fatigued. And that's your starting point. And so once you go through what we call stage one, looking at the task, looking what the vulnerabilities are, looking what the potential outcomes are, the probabilities, and then trying to control at the task based, then there is, a widely accepted practice to, endeavor down to determine what are the levels of fatigue, say, for instance, in a Foxtrot team that's going have international travel, working consecutive up to 36 hours, like high demand workload, etc. There's some real value that can be gained in establishing shift schedules and determining levels of impairment. So I think there's a niche, and we know that this area is growing rapidly, but there is some research that says proceed with caution. Does that help, Roberta?
Also, I'll just wait and see if she has a follow-up question in the chat, but she's also left you another question in the Q&A. So basically, could you describe which, oh, sorry, she says, yes, it helps.
Okay.
And then would it be possible to drill down into incidents to identify where fatigue was identified as a factor?
Mhm. Absolutely. We at WorkSafeBC and with other agencies, we've developed and encouraged the development of a fatigue task force. And so now you have a set of people that is basically doing a qualitative task analysis. And so we've done this with reversing mobile equipment. We've done this on other topics where you look at previous incidents and you're trying to cull out the factors that may be having a fatigue-related role. And in the news, there's been several incidents that have been either serious and or fatal that involve the operation of mobile equipment or dealing with rolling stock, and different other complex planning starting early in the morning and ending late in the afternoon. And while the hazards remain, working with mobile equipment, dealing with heavy equipment, trying to maneuver it, trying to explain procedures, etc. There is an overlay of fatigue that, as I was explaining throughout, that actually escalate the risk of harm when it comes to interacting with those hazards. So yeah, we have done that, and it's to understand some of the key areas and the priorities that can be a useful starting point.
All right, so this will be just the last question because we've hit that 1 o'clock mark,
Okay.
so some people might have to be leaving, but this one's also from Roberta. So could you describe which HSAs risk management is doing work with and what types of projects you may be working on?
Wow, that's a big question. I want to say virtually all, so we're definitely working with HSAs in transportation, forestry, and they might even be online today. So transportation, forestry, I don't know what industry, like the heli ski, so the recreational sport industry, manufacturing, and municipalities. Yeah, so there's a number of very, like with the Manufacturing Safety Alliance of BC, they are developing resources, currently engaging in conversations with key players in the construction industry to develop resources and expand the perspective. And I've been working with CROSH, and we've had some success and interest working with academia as well as mining. So it's really taking traction across the board, really.
Perfect. And she just says, thank you for your answer. All right, so that'll wrap up today's webinar. Thank you for everyone who's attended today. If you had a question and it wasn't answered during the Q&A, Heather has provided her personal email as well as the sort of general email for where she works. If you want to send up a follow-up question, hope that didn't come out easily. If you want to watch the presentation again, keep your eye on the CROSH website. It'll be archived on there in a couple of days, and then you'll get any extra information that you need from there. So thank you again to Heather, and for everyone who attended the presentation. Have a nice day, everyone.
Thank you so much, everybody. Real pleasure to speak with you and provide you with this information. And absolutely feel free to reach out if you have any questions or follow-up concerns. Thank you.